Okay, this clock over here is a bit of a mixture. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You've all seen the place, the time you've been there when the minister takes off his watch and with a great flourish sets it up in front here, you know, so that you know there's going to be a time allotment. You probably have all heard the old story of the father who took his young son to church. And the young son had been in Sunday school, but not in church often, so he got asking questions. Daddy, why did they sing Amen? So Daddy was pretty good to the young fellow, and he tried to explain to him as best he could why they sing Amen. And then he got looking around the room, and Daddy, what's that picture in the window? And Daddy explained to it. And then the minister came out with his pocket watch and had a great flurry and set it on there and said, Daddy, what does that mean? He said, that means nothing. Anyway, I'm sure you didn't expect that I would be here addressing you on 2 breakfasts in a row, but I have to explain to you that I'm helping, not taking the place of Ralph this morning. I think we realize that Ralph has had a rather difficult month or 2, and so as good Presbyterians, you're here and I'm here to help as much as we can. So here I am, and we're going to work through this in the next few minutes. This is a particularly emotional moment for Ralph, and I would have to say for me, because the first time, as soon as we began talking about the 175th anniversary of this church, there was nobody who came on side so quickly as Jean Harkes. She got excited. She was very proud of her Lewis ancestry, and we had many, many, many talks about how she was related. As a matter of fact, when we put together this book, some of you may have read it so far, but the page that I'm the most proud of is page 1, which I guess it's not page 1. I don't know how these things go, but anyway, it's the page that says, Honoring the Past 175 Years. And we found that there was a rather unique situation in this church, that after 175 years of being in this community, we had 2 families who had direct connections with the very first presence of Presbyterianism in this area. And the one, of course, was Jean Harkes. And when I read various things, Jean was either the great-great-great niece of Alexander Lewis, and we worked around that. And the way she wanted it printed in the book was this, that Jean Harkes' great-great-grandfather, James Lewis, was a brother of Alexander Lewis. So we have the Lewis family directly connected to this church, and then we have the treasurer, the Harkes family, directly connected with this church, because they have been through thick and thin from 1925 right to the present. So we're going to talk about that in just a moment. I want to say that I feel like an imposter here, but I think you understand that Ralph and I have talked about this, and we're going to sort of play this back and forth. I'm going to talk a little, and if you have questions, you can ask them, and we have Ralph here to corroborate whatever we happen to bring up. The only other thing I want to mention before I talk about Ralph's paper here was the picture that's at the bottom of that same page. And I have to tell you that this was something of a special occasion. The picture, in case you haven't read the book yet, is a picture of Earl and Grace Dodds and Jean and Ralph Harkes at the memorial of Reverend Alexander Lewis out in the Mono East Cemetery. We had talked about this from probably almost this time last year, and as you know, it's difficult to get 5 people all together at the same time. If any of you have been to the Mono East Cemetery, you will know that there's a dreadful ditch along 5 Side Road to get up to that cemetery. It's now it's not an active cemetery. So how do you get someone that has a little difficulty walking and breathing up this terrible hill? Well, with the help of Earl Dodds, the Mono Township Roads Department put us in a culvert. And that made it a little easier to get up there. But when we looked at it, it wasn't all that much improved. Anyway, we worked back and forth all summer to get a date when we would get a picture of those two families at this particular special place in Mono Township. And finally one day in early September, everything turned out right. And we got out there and got that picture. And if we hadn't have done it that day, it wasn't long after that that it wouldn't have been possible. So as I say, that's the page that I think as a congregation we might be particularly proud of. Now, to turn to Ralph's paper that he has written, and he has called it The Highlights of Change of the Events from 1925 to the Present. I think maybe before I'll make a little paraphrase of what Wayne told you last week, in case you have forgotten, as students often do. You'll recall that the first church in Orangeville that was Presbyterian was Bethel Presbyterian Church, a little log affair down behind the town hall. Well, then, with the help of Orange Lawrence, who was the developer of land in this area, he gave them property here on Broadway, where the present post office stands. And under Reverend Lewis's help and with that congregation, they built Bethel Presbyterian Church II, which was a lovely stone church, which sat practically where the post office is today. But they also had a rather large cemetery. And so the cemetery surrounded that church, and it stayed in existence until 1880. Now that was the Bethel. There was a Zion Presbyterian Church, which of course, now I should tell you, Bethel was the Old Kirk Presbyterian Church. There was another one called the Canadian Presbyterian Church, and they built what I can gather was a log, not a log, but a frame building. Records say it had Gothic windows. Now, what picture does that bring in your mind? It's a frame building, but it has Gothic windows. Anyway, it was a substantial sized church, could seat probably between 270 and 300 people. Well, it was built down in Alexander Park, well, at the corner of First Avenue and 2nd Street. It's in there. And it only lasted a few years because it burned to the ground. Well, then that church, that was Zion, they had a problem. They had to either rebuild that church there or do something else. Well, the idea came about that they would hire the very best architect in this area at that time, who was from Guelph. His name was Soule, and he designed the county building over there on Zina Street, which is today considered a remarkable building. Well, he designed this church up here, which became known as Zion II. Well, of course, the town wanted a place to build a new post office. And the town wanted to get rid of that cemetery, which was on Main Street, because the wells to supplying Orangeville at that time were on Broadway. So with a little push and a shove and here and there, the Bethel II, which was just over here, decided to sell the property, close up shop, and join up with Zion II, which was being built then up on West Broadway. Now everything went fine from 1880 until 1925, and then, as we say, you know what broke loose. It wasn't pleasant. The families in this town split, didn't talk to one another for years, and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, the group that are our ancestors, as far as Presbyterians, left that church, which was by this time called St. Andrew's, and went off on their own. And that's where I begin with Ralph's talk. So, the highlights of the change of events from 1925. Many Presbyterians were opposed to church union. They wanted Presbyterianism to live in Orangeville. The nays lost. Well, yes, they did. Bess Marshall's book says that the vote went something like this. There were 236 votes for union. There were 158 votes for not union, which meant that there was 40% of the vote didn't want to carry on union. Well, anyway, the nays lost. They left St. Andrews, now which is Westminster United, and the group was left with no minister, no building, and no money. Now we get to some important dates. January the 13th, 1925. That's exactly the day after the vote took place and the nays lost. A group of 18 men and women met in the basement of the public library. The late Dr. G.H. Campbell made the first motion that an executive committee be formed for the purpose carrying on the work of the Presbyterian Church. It was agreed that all members present be on that committee. Now, Ralph wrote a little footnote here about Dr. Campbell, which I think I'll read at this time, because this Dr. Campbell was pretty well known in town, and he was apparently a pretty forceful character. Dr. Campbell appeared to be the driving force that started the first meeting and many others to follow. To our knowledge, he was never on the session, but on the board of managers for many, many years. When the official opening took place, it was Dr. Campbell who opened the door and gave the moderator of the presbytery the keys to the church. Now, you may wonder why that happened. In the Presbyterian system, all property belongs to the presbytery. Although we, the congregation, build it, maintain it, in the final sense, the presbytery owns the property. So, for example, if ever the church is sold, the presbytery owns that property. So anyway, that was why Dr. Campbell, the moderator of the presbytery, gave a great rap on the front door. You can picture this. You're sitting up in the chair, and all of a sudden, whammo, there's a great rap on the door, which meant the presbytery were ready to enter. And so there was Dr. Campbell standing inside, threw the door open, and presented the keys to the presbytery. So that's the way it worked. So he opened the door and gave the moderator the keys. Now, Dr. Campbell's great-grandmother, that's right, Ralph? Great-grandmother, yeah. Dr. Campbell's great-grandmother was the daughter of Reverend Alexander Lewis. So you see, there was a continuing connection there between the Lewises and the Campbells, and Dr. Campbell lived right up until the 70s, so there was a connection there. Okay, we're now at January the 13th, 1925, and we have explained that Dr. Campbell opened the church. Ralph has put in, I think, a very appropriate scripture verse here. Matthew chapter 18, verse 30 says, For where two or three are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst of them. So those folks must have been thinking about that. Now, Mr. Sam Merlina, the owner of the Gem Theater on Broadway, offered the heated theater free of charge until the committee could find a suitable building. Now, I'm wondering, I'm curious about that Gem Theater, but I cannot find it. It must have been, recall anything about it? Yeah. Well, that's what I suspected, that there was a piano there, where the First Presbyterians probably did a bit of singing over there. Anyway, that's beside the point. Now, an interesting point at this, right about now, was this, that you see the United, let me explain it this way. The United Church is called the United Church of Canada. The Presbyterian Church is called the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Now, do you see the distinction there? Because it means there are Presbyterian churches in Scotland, in the United States, in Australia, but the United Church is the United Church of Canada. There never was development quite like the forming of the United Church, because it got past just church affairs, but it got into the political arena. And then the politicians got into this thing. And of course, the United Church of Canada came into being because of an act of the Canadian Parliament. And no other country in the world has ever quite done that. Now, I'll tell you one reason why the Presbyterians were a little against that. In Scotland, there'd been a great ruckus whether they wanted the Church of Scotland to be funded by the state or whether they wanted the church to be funded by its own people. And Presbyterians are very, very jealously regarded that they fund their own business, so therefore they appoint or elect their own officials. And that was one of the upsets that came here. Anyway, let's get back to the script here. Dr. Campbell wrote quite a few interesting little tidbits about what had gone on in this church. And one that I discovered this year, and this is not Ralph's, I'm putting this in, Ralph, as a little aside. But here is Ralph in his story has said they had no money, they were sort of high and dry, and yet at one of their meetings, they decided that they would put an offer in to buy either Westminster, which is now Westminster, or it was St. Andrew's Church there, that big, beautiful church. They put an offer in to buy that, or the other United Church, which was First Avenue Methodist. Now, the government in its wisdom had, among other things, when they passed this bill, they also formed, and I think it's called, the United Church Adjustment Commission. And I guess those boys had a fair bit of power because they had control of how real estate disputes were going to take place. And you can imagine there had to be some rather heated real estate disputes when all of a sudden, all that group of people who voted no, they had nothing but just simply to walk out and leave their goods and chattels behind. Well, this Dr. Campbell and his group decided they would put an offer into this commission to buy one of those churches, but they wouldn't play ball at all. It's interesting what would have happened if they had have said, yeah, we'll sell you the big church. I mean, because, man, you, they didn't have any money. But they were gung-ho on getting a church. Back to the script. February the 14th, 1925, services began with the help of the Presbyterian ministers from Erin, Hillsburg, Grand Valley, along with student ministers from Knox College, Toronto. The communicant members now numbered 60. Okay, now we're going to April the 1st, 1926. The building immediately west of the CIBC, 205 Broadway, once known as the Orangeville Business College, was purchased for approximately $3,000. Approximately $1,000 was spent on the renovations for that building. And there was it says, as Ralph says, this was a huge venture and money was scarce. Well, I guess. Now, I'm going to just break away for a minute. A story that was told to me, I think, by Dalton Patterson, who was Arnold's father. And he was busy around about at that time. And apparently, this church was a storefront church. The building's still there, so it was just a store. And they made it into a church. But it was a great place for the young people to meet. It was on Broadway, and Broadway at that time was a busy place. And I'm told that the young people, the Presbyterian young people at that time was the busiest place on a Sunday night of any place in the town. Now, I don't know much about it other than that, but you can sort of see how the kids would like together. Broadway was the main thoroughfare, and apparently they brought in young people from other groups as well. Okay, now we're up to May the 31st, 1926. The Reverend I.B. Kane was inducted to the joint pastorate of Orangeville and Waldemar, and he ministered until October the 28th, 1928. The Orangeville Presbytery had joined Waldemar with Orangeville, thinking it would be a good arrangement. Now, of course, Grand Valley was closer, but the Waldemar people seemed to like the idea of being part of this pastoral charge. Okay, we're up now to September the 26th, 29. Reverend W.W. McCrae was inducted as successor to Mr. Kane, and he resigned on March the 25th, 34. Now, Ralph does mention this at a later time, but I'm just going to insert this here. This is 1934, and when we were going over the records of the church, the very first indication that anybody had even thought of building a church came in 1934 at a January meeting. No, it wasn't. It was a March meeting, March the 7th, 1934, and a Mrs. Armstrong and a Mrs. Dr. Campbell, again, these two ladies from the Ladies' Aid presented themselves at a board meeting. And apparently they had some fairly strong notions. I must tell you that before that time, the Board of Managers had, well, they'd had financial difficulties. But people who have been on the boards here know that if you're really short of money, you ask the ladies of the church if they have a few dollars tucked away in their apron someplace. And apparently this had been going on for quite a number of years. When the board ran into a bit of problems with all these difficulties, the Ladies' Aid could always be counted on to help them out. Well, in this case, these two ladies marched into the Board of Managers meeting and told the Board of Managers politely that from there on, their major project, in fact, their only project, was going to have a building fund to build a new church. And that sort of told the board, I guess, that they were on their own. As far as the rest of it was concerned, that was it. So there, in March the 7th, 1934, was the very first notion that there would ever be a church. Now, January the 13th, 35, Reverend J.H. Woodside, LLD, he was also a theological degree and also had a lawyer's degree. He succeeded Reverend McCrae. And Ralph, I'm reading from Ralph's manuscript, he resigned October the 4th, 1938. We're not here to sort of air our dirty laundry, but some of you may know this story, but we're not going to go into it. It was a very unfortunate situation happened here. The minister, well-meaning, I suppose, and he had done this before. He had raised money to build a church. And he had come from Toronto, and he knew that there were many wealthy Presbyterians in Toronto, and he had collected money. So, believe it or not, the session of this church at that point thought it might be a good idea if Dr. Woodside was given a month's leave of absence and he could go and tap these people for the money that he thought he could gather. Well, now we're coming into the Depression, 1938, and it wasn't as easy to collect money as it had been 10 years before. And so he arrived back here with the sad notion that he wasn't able to do what he had hoped to do, but if he were given a little more time, he could do better. So they gave him a little more time, and I'm not getting into the rest of this. The upshot of the whole thing was that whole business of raising funds just fell apart. As Ralph said, he said he resigned. He was resigned with a little push, and the money never showed up. And a year later, the poor Reverend Woodside passed away. So how that worked out, no one is absolutely sure. The only thing is, after an episode like that, how did this church ever get built? You know, that's pretty significant. Anyway, we've got Dr. Woodside is out of the picture now. And on February the 28th, 39, returning to the script here, Reverend H. Lindsay Simpson was inducted to the pastorate of Orangeville and Waldorf. Reverend Simpson was a Scotsman with a very thick accent, I gather, Ralph. Very thick. Okay. He arrived here by way of Valleyfield, Quebec, which had been his first charge in Canada. Previous to his arrival, as we've already said, the ladies of the church had been putting pressure on the board to find a more suitable place for worship and a residence for the minister. Reverend Simpson possessed exceptional power of oratory and he issued a challenge to build a proper church or give up. Well, his challenge was accepted, and accepting that challenge at that particular time must have been quite a thing, because remember, as Ralph says here, the country was suffering from the worst depression that it had ever seen, and the World War was approaching. In fact, it was already on. The dates I'll mention in just a minute. So there we have it. We're on our way to building this church. On September the 17th, 1939, the congregation agreed unanimously to buy the property of the late Dr. Rooney for $3,000. That's the manse, was Dr. Rooney's residence, and where we're sitting was Dr. Rooney's garden. And behind me here was the old curling rink. So if you get a picture, the manse was there, this was Dr. Rooney's garden, and that's the old curling rink. So they purchased it for $3,000. Now, where did the $3,000 come from? This doesn't say. They had to have a magical way of financing things here, but there must have been some very generous people. Because, as I continue here, this action provided the people of Orangeville with one of the loveliest manses in Canada and a suitable lot for building a church on it. And the property was paid for at the time of the transfer. $3,000 just came out of somewhere. On January the 29th, 1940, at a Board of Managers meeting, a motion was made that they consider the building of a new church. The future of this congregation depended on this decision. The present building, that was the one, the storefront over on Broadway, was unsuitable for congregational life. A finance committee and a building committee was appointed, and an architect, Doug Kiles, was commissioned, and a builder, Herb Hughes, was hired. On August the 22nd, 1940, now, those of you who remember the war, by August the 22nd, things weren't very good in Europe. In fact, they were approaching probably their worst. Anyway, we had a sod turning here in Orangeville for this church amidst all that. September the 20th, 1940, the cornerstone was laid, and the service was conducted by Reverend W. Barclay, B.D., the moderator of the General Assembly. While they were doing this, they had some pretty influential people involved. Some of the top-notch ministers of Toronto took a great interest in the building of this church. And here was the moderator of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And about 200 people attended that ceremony. A memorial committee was appointed. Now, the stone for Tweedsmuir, as many of you know, was cleaned, and then it was hauled up here on John Street by the men of the church from the defunct Portland Cement Company. It was located at the south end of John Street, south of the town line, and the men cleaned it and brought it up here for building it. Now, there's a little story about the extra stone. When Wayne was talking to you last week, he indicated that there may have been some extra stone bought, and that may have been for the capstones on the buttresses that go on the church. But John Rayburn and I both agree that there was a surplus stone. They didn't leave any down there to just waste. Hey, we might find a use for that. And so when they built the original church, which would be where that would be the end of the church, where that little wall comes out there, that was it. And this was the size of the thing. They brought up enough extra stone so that when they extended the church, there was enough stone sitting in the back here to put in that wall. Now, that sounds like quite a lot of extra stone, but when you think of it, they broke out the north wall and just removed it. So the wall with the chancel windows was just sent north. And the Christian education wing took a lot of this side. So really, all the extra stone they needed at that time was really for that east wall from here to the corner. Anyway, they had enough stone when they built the extension, sitting there. When they built the extension of the narthex, they had stone still left over. And believe it or not, there's still a pile of stone out in John Rayburn's field that should we ever need to build again. Yes, it would. Anyway, the cost of that stone was $128. Now, that sounds like very little, but I guess those men who cleaned that stone and hauled it up here thought it was probably lots. Anyway, there's one other story that's not, Ralph didn't mention this, and I can't tell you that this is anybody's story but my own, but I was told this for a fact. This beautiful dining room, which at that time had to be one of the most remarkable in town, you'll notice has no pillars in the middle. The reason being, these are steel beams. Now keep in mind, this is 1940. Those of you who know about the war know that Hitler was doing his best in September 1940 to bomb the Londoners out of their wits. And we in Canada were into a deep war effort. And what surprises me is this. They tell me that it was Dr. C.I. Scott who insisted that these steel beams be put in here. Otherwise, we would have a row of pillars, because if these had been wooden beams, they would have had been supported by beams, so we would have had a row of pillars down the center of this building. So Dr. Scott said, no, we are going to put in steel beams, even though they cost a lot more. The question I have in my mind, where in the world did he get these steel beams? Because at that time, everything was tight. In fact, I don't know how they found enough cement to build this building, because at that time, cement, except for farmers and a few others, could not get a bag of cement to save your life. And steel beams were out of the question, because the government was building barracks for soldiers in Camp Borden and all over. Somehow, somebody must have known the right people to talk to, because our steel beams give us this beautiful open room. Okay, that's the, where am I here? Steel beams. Okay, continuing with Ralph's paper. May the 1st, 1941. And it was Thursday, May the 1st, 1941, not Sunday, Thursday. The dedication of Tweedsmuir Memorial Presbyterian Church took place. The moderator of the presbytery, accompanied by the session and other ministers, entered the church through the main door. Dr. Campbell handed the keys of the church to the moderator, and they proceeded up the aisle, and I might say singing, "Ye gates, lift up your heads on high," which you did this morning. And they proceeded up the aisle, followed by the choir, who were lined up at the back wall of the church. Ralph's second oldest sister, Grace, was a member of that choir, and she remembers the knocking on the door quite vividly. So we have somebody that was actually at that opening service. On the 4 succeeding Sundays, which was in that year, May the 4th, 16th, 18th, and 25th, there were guest ministers preaching at both the morning and evening service. Perhaps just a little comment about the evening service would be in order here, Ralph. This church, well, most Presbyterian churches had an evening service, and it would be quite well attended. Not as much as the 11 o'clock, but the evening services here in the 1960s were fairly well attended. Reverend John Newt was the minister. And there had been a falling off of the attendance at the evening service, and there had been discussions, which I found in the minutes, of would we continue the evening service or wouldn't we? And I think it's remarkable how things work politically, because as long as Reverend Newt was here, there was no question. Then the next minister was Reverend Dennis Gibson, and he was from Ireland, and he had very firm ideas about what should take place. And yes, we would have an evening service. But towards the end of Reverend Gibson's tenure, there was a move in session, because it was hardly worth opening the church and having the choir and so on. So there was a lot of correspondence whether we would close the church for the evening service or not. And until then, Reverend Gibson stayed, the evening service was held. But then there was an interim there where the one minister resigned and the next minister hadn't got here yet. And somehow in that interim, the evening service just disappeared. So when the cat's away, Harvey. And one other little thing just before I finish with Ralph's talk here. There was always an evening preparatory service. Do anybody here remember coming to church on an evening through the week and having a preparatory service besides Ralph and I? Yeah? Well, before communion service, before the Sunday communion, there would always be an evening service called a preparatory service. Guess what? To prepare you for that important event on Sunday. The communion was a very, very important part of the Presbyterian faith. Okay, we're moving up now to 1948. Orangeville High School burnt down, leaving about 300 students without a school. The school burnt down on a Sunday night on a very cold February evening. So Tweedsmuir Church basement, that was from that little alcove here back, this became a classroom. But at that time, the floor was cement. And of course, had to have a wooden floor. So Tweedsmuir benefited by the fact that the school board gave us a new wooden floor. And then they had classes here for about a year, a little over a year. And of course, they didn't take the floor with them when they left, so we had a wooden floor. Okay, now the wooden floor was installed, and then the kids, and finally, this was just one of the many churches in town that was used for that educational purpose. You might wonder, the teachers were the ones that moved. There was classes in this church, there were classes in Westminster, there were classes over in First Ave, and I think some down in Dalton Patterson's store. And few remember. And the teachers would move, the kids would stay, and the teachers would move around this thing. It was quite a time for the Orangeville students. Moving on, 1959, the property immediately north of the church and home of the Orangeville curling rink was purchased by Tweedsmuir and the building torn down. Now, by that time, it was just used for storage. In the minutes, there were a lot of instances where the session here were having all kinds of problems with drainage off that building, and they would decide that something had to be done with that building. And so finally, I guess they decided they'd buy it, and that was that. I'm told that it was used for storage. I was even told recently that it was used as a depot for Canada Bread for a little while. So anyway, the old building next door, there's a picture of it in your history book. They bought that thing, and that gave them the needed space to build again. This provided land needed to extend the existing church. During the removal of the north wall, the church was closed and services were held in ODSS auditorium until the new church was completed. Now, the cornerstone. Who know what's on the cornerstone of the extended building? One, Ralph does. Well, take a look at it when you go out. It's not the normal cornerstone. Not only does it have the date 1959 on it, but it has a superscription which in effect says, that I may know him. Now that comes from Philippians. I've got it down here, Philippians chapter 3, verse 10. And St. Paul is telling the Philippians what a time he has had to know Christ fully. Now that was suggested by Reverend John Newt, and it was put on the cornerstone, although that cornerstone was laid a little differently than most. If you see the picture in the history book here, you'll see that the cornerstone is being dedicated, but there's a full wall there. So the cornerstone, the wall was built and then the cornerstone was fit in. And I'm told that they put in newspapers behind that thing, wrapped in plastic. I guess they thought plastic was going to last forever, but if that stone ever comes out, it probably won't be much left there. But anyway, the newspapers were put in behind that stone. And why I mention that is that our motto for this church later became to know Christ and to make him known. And you see the connection? It's really a continuation, that I may know him, to know Christ and make him known. Okay, we're up to 1960. The new windows in the new section, if you look carefully, you'll note that they match identically with the windows on the old section. And the reason that happened was that all these windows in the church were created by the artists at McCausland's in Toronto. And that company still makes stained glass windows. So the new section, you can't tell them apart from the old ones because they were made by the same company. And they were dedicated. Now, one thing that Ralph didn't mention at all, and he told me here on a final page I'm getting to, that I could add something if I wanted to. He didn't mention anything about the organ. But anyway, I have to tell you this, just as a closing. The original organ was purchased when the church was this large, like upstairs, it was just this large. It just went to the center section. So the Hammond organ was purchased for a building that was about half the size of the building that we ended up with. And furthermore, the organ was parked in behind the arch upstairs. And so the congregation couldn't see the organist. The organist could only see half his choir. And it wasn't just working too well. Now, they tried all kinds of things. Even I read in the minutes, they tried a sound box, whatever that looked like. I have no idea. The sound box didn't work. So finally, a new organ was proposed, the Conn organ that we have today, and it was installed in 1974 and dedicated in 1975. Talking of fundraising, Ralph, do you remember the fundraising we had with that? I think there was one Saturday morning. How many of us went out collecting? We hit quite a number in the congregation, and the organ was paid for about 2 or 3 weeks after it was installed. Anyway, there it is. Now, moving on to more recent times, Reverend Harvey Self was elected moderator of the 135th General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And that was the only time that we've had a minister of this church who was elevated to the position of moderator of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. So, congratulations again, sir. Since Tweedsmuir opened in 1941, there have been 10 ministers, with Reverend H.L. Simpson, the beginner, and Reverend Harvey Self to the present. Now, I should mention to those of you who don't know, in the narthex there are the pictures of each of the ministers who have served in this church, and that little project was a project of the Ladies' Fellowship Group back in, 25 years ago, when we celebrated our 150th anniversary, and the ladies of the fellowship group, with some difficulty, I think, found the pictures of each of those ministers, and that has been continued on. I think, Harvey, you're part of that long procession. Now, just to complete, a little note about the Harkey's family. Very seldom would a church have someone who had attended Sunday school and was still in the church after all these years. So, Ralph, in many sense, you are our treasure. You are our historical treasure, because he saw these things happen and was here for them. So the Harkey's family have been in Tweedsmuir, or this congregation, involved since February the 14th, 1925, when the first service was held in the Gem Theatre. Now, Ralph's oldest sister, Bessie, many of us would remember her as Bessie Eason, attended Sunday school over there. So that was the beginning of the Harkey's involvement. And by the way, that Sunday school, the superintendent was Dr. Campbell. He was Mr. Everything at that time. Now, when the congregation moved in 1926 to the 205 Broadway, which is the storefront church just west of the Bank of Commerce, all of the 8 Harkey's children attended Sunday school there. And then they came over in 1941 to Tweedsmuir. And I told you before about the opening of the church on that May Day in 1941. Ralph's sister was in the choir, so she was back at the back wall there listening to all and seeing all this happening. One thing I didn't mention, and I think I will, just before I finish, no one, I think, has asked or even questioned why was the church opened on a Thursday instead of Sunday, like we would expect these things happen on Sunday. Well, the answer was that Orangeville had a half-day holiday for its merchants, and Thursday afternoon at that time happened to be the half-day holiday. So they had a rather large crowd of the merchants off fact Broadway was closed, so nothing else was happening. So Tweedsmuir Church was opening, so let's go see what's happening. So they had a tremendous crowd. I want to thank Ralph for his paper. Normally there'd be somebody come to give thanks to the speaker, but I don't know. Ralph, it's you and I, so I want you to thank Ralph for being here and for... And I don't know, what's the time, what happened here?